The story opens in a quiet roadside diner. Laura sits alone in a booth, pale and crying, wearing an old-fashioned dress with mud still clinging to her feet. Two men enter and sit behind her. One of them stares, unblinking. Fear takes hold. Laura suddenly stands, revealing she's heavily pregnant, and bolts out the door as the men follow. Out on the rainy road, she collapses, crying and gasping for breath as labor begins. Screaming in pain, she looks down and repeatedly says,
"I don't want you! I don't want you!"
A baby's cry pierces the night. Laura frozen in shock, until a slow, unsettling smile spreads across her face. Several years later, the boy, now named David, is 8 years old. Laura tries to live a normal life. Her neighbor, Susan, helps by watching David whenever Laura has other responsibilities. After dropping him off at school, Laura teaches young children, patiently guiding them through the alphabet. Later that day, she rushes to attend her own classes. In one lecture, the instructor talks about people who have experienced trauma, how they often develop obsessions tied to it, constantly worrying about their own safety and the safety of those they love. That night, Laura picks David up from Susan's house. The boy runs out excitedly and wraps her in a big hug. At home, Laura turns off the TV and tells David it's time for bed. When she reaches for the light, David insists on keeping it on, just in case zombies show up. Laura smiles and gently reminds him not to watch or play anything scary before sleeping. Later, as Laura sits on her bed studying, she hears footsteps approaching. Assuming it's David, she looks into the hallway, but no one is there. David's bedroom door is closed. She opens it. Inside, a group of people stands silently around David's bed. The door suddenly slams shut. Laura screams David's name and desperately tries to open the door, but it won't open. Terrified, she runs outside to Susan's house and begs her to call the police, convinced that intruders are inside her son's room. When Laura returns home, she's gripping a kitchen knife. David's bedroom door is now open, and the strangers are gone. David lies sideways on the bed, his shirt stripped from his body. Moments later, the police arrive. Disturbingly, they find no evidence of a break-in. One officer, Paul, gently asks if she might have left the door unlocked or misplaced a key. Laura insists she always double-checks. Everything in the house was locked. The other officer, Steve, suggests she may have been dreaming, sleepwalking, or dealing with stress from a recent breakup. Irritated and shaken, Laura snaps back with sharp, sarcastic replies. Paul quickly steps in and sends Steve back to the station. Alone with Laura, Paul lowers his voice and tells her he believes her. He promises they'll find whoever did this and apologizes for his partner's insensitivity. Laura clearly relieved that, at the very least, someone is on her side. Moments later, Laura quietly entered David's room, overwhelmed with emotion. She carefully checks his head, his body, even his teeth. When David stirs and sleepily asks what she's doing, Laura asks if he remembers what happened. David shakes his head. He doesn't remember anything. But then he adds something chilling. He says he was dreaming, that he was drowning in a river of blood. The next day, while Laura is teaching in class, Officer Paul shows up with no new leads. He gently asks if she's holding up. Laura sighs and admits that David could have taken off his pajamas himself, but she's still certain those people were in his room. Paul gives her his card, offering help if she needs anything, then leaves. That night, Laura sleeps beneath a wooden symbol mounted above her bed. Outside, a banner flaps in the wind, bearing the words, "He is coming." A voice whispers, "Wake up, honey." Laura jolts awake. Just a dream. She turns toward David and suddenly sees him covered in blood, screaming. She wakes again, back in reality, lying beside him. David groans, complaining of a headache and a sick stomach. Laura promises to take him to the doctor in the morning if he's still unwell. Then she hears heavy thuds downstairs. She tiptoes down the steps and catches a glimpse of a shadow moving behind the glass. Panicked, she calls Paul. He arrives quickly and searches the house but finds nothing. He reassures her that whoever it was won't come back now that the police are involved. Before they can say more, David stumbles down the stairs, moaning in pain, then collapses, vomiting blood. They rush him to the hospital. David breaks out in a strange rash, and Laura watches helplessly as he suffers. The doctors explain that every test, poisons, narcotics, infections, has come back negative. When Laura asks what comes next, the doctor quietly tells her to prepare herself. David may never wake up again. Devastated, Laura assumes he must have been poisoned, but the doctor insists that's impossible. Even Paul has no answers now. With no options left, Laura holds David's hand and tearfully tells him it's okay to let go. Then, something changes. The door slowly swings open, as if someone has just left. David begins coughing again, blood on his lips. Doctors rush in. And suddenly, David wakes up. He weakly whispers, "Mommy." Miraculously, he recovers almost instantly. Later, they go to a Chinese restaurant to celebrate. Though Laura notices David doesn't touch his meal. She's just grateful he's alive. She tells Paul they're thinking of selling the house and starting over. Paul urges her not to let fear drive her away. That night, after putting David to bed, Laura confides in Paul that David likes him, something he doesn't do easily. Grateful and emotional, she asks Paul to stay. One moment leads to another, until David screams from upstairs. They find him violently convulsing. Back at the hospital, Laura looks anxious as the doctor gives her the same results, but they will continue testing David again. Laura finally tells Paul the truth about her past. She was raised in a cult and escaped 8 years ago. She's now certain they were the ones in David's room. Before she can say more, the doctor calls her away. David's body twists unnaturally, his jaw cracking as if chewing something unseen. Laura holds him as terrifying memories of her past flood back. Dark rituals, voices in the woods, and the cult's command, "Say the words." Laura hears the doctors talking in the hallway and peeks through the door, overhearing them say that the boy is the priority. Laura also notices a black car outside, and men rushing toward the hospital. Realizing the cult has found them, she flees with David in a taxi, cradling him as he wheezes. She takes him to Susan's house, but Susan panics and insists on taking David back to the hospital. Laura argues that the doctors can't help him. She promises to leave briefly to grab supplies from home, and then they will leave. Paul calls her, urgently warning that everyone is looking for her, and that she can't trust anyone. Laura orders him to bring his gun and hangs up. When she returns to Susan's house, the door is locked. Inside, a lamp lies knocked over. Laura enters through the back, gripping a knife and a hammer. From inside, she hears whimpering and the sound of something dripping. She steps closer and is met with a horrifying sight. David is munching on Susan's body, tearing into her insides without hesitation. The boy grunts and looks up at his mother. He says he feels better now. Laura immediately takes David home and washes the blood from his body. Afterward, she lays him in bed and gently tells him it's time to sleep. Then she turns around and goes back to Susan's house. Holding back tears, Laura stares at the gruesome corpse, finally accepting that something is horribly wrong with her son. Fighting her nausea, she wraps Susan's body in a rug and writes a message on the wall. "He is coming." Beside it, she draws the cult's familiar symbol, trying to shift the blame onto them. She retrieves David, and the two speed off into the night. Paul calls again, but Laura tosses her phone out the window without hesitation. They stop for the night at a roadside motel. David, still full of energy, flips on the TV, begging to watch a little longer. Exhausted, Laura barely has the strength to argue. She just needs sleep. The next morning, officers Steve and Paul arrive at Susan's house and discover the body. Meanwhile, Laura wakes up to shocking news. They're all over the television. Both of them are now missing, and a full search is underway. Laura gets hold of an old, barely reliable car and drives on. When David asks where they're going, she tells him they're going to find an old friend from her childhood, someone she hopes can help her uncover the buried memories of her troubled past. Meanwhile, Steve and Paul bring Susan's body to the morgue. Steve shows Paul several old newspaper clippings revealing Laura's past. She once went by the name Anna and was sexually abused by her father. Steve is convinced Laura murdered her neighbor, Susan, believing the cult story is nothing more than a delusion she created to cope with the deep trauma she endured. Laura and David arrive at Mrs. Nagel. Laura introduces herself as Anna, revealing her real name. Mrs. Nagel, Jimmy's mother, immediately recognizes her. Once inside, she quietly asks if David is the boy, then reveals that she, too, was once part of the cult. She spoke about David, how something so beautiful and innocent could possibly come from such deep evil. Laura quickly cut her off, leaning close to David and whispering that the woman was crazy, urging him to put on his music and tune her out. Laura then asks about her childhood friend, Jimmy. She needs to know where he is now. The old woman sighs and explains that Jimmy hasn't been doing well, drifting in and out of prison over the past 5 years. She adds that Jimmy has moved to a desolate area of Mississippi. Meanwhile, Paul looked into the hospital where Laura had gone to recover, tracking down the retired Dr. Bradley. Laura finally arrives at Jimmy's property. Jimmy opens the door and greets her. Laura introduces her son, David, before they come inside. Meanwhile, Paul meets with Dr. Bradley, the psychiatrist who treated Laura years earlier. He asked him about Anna's trauma, about her father, and the stories of the so-called cult. Dr. Bradley denies that any cult ever existed. No secret rituals. No organized group. It was all born from Laura's fractured mind, a fabricated reality created to survive unbearable pain. He explains that she suffered extreme psychotic episodes, brought on by severe childhood trauma. The truth, he says. Laura's father exploited her. He sold her to different men for money, and Jimmy's name was tied to it as well. Jimmy apologizes for never visiting Laura at the hospital, explaining that the doctors wouldn't allow him. He bitterly blames them for messing with his head. Laura agrees. She admits that when she was discharged, she was so heavily medicated that she barely remembered anything. Jimmy, however, remembers everything. He recalls the cult's rituals, ceremonies involving chanting, violence, and the killing of animals, often carried out in Laura's bedroom. They forced her to repeat sacred words, and she was the only one who could recite them correctly. The others tried and failed, which is why she was considered special. Jimmy claims her so-called father taught her these words to summon a demon known as the Huntsman. He insists that no man in the cult ever touched her, that she was reserved solely for the demon itself. Laura argues back, saying she remembers her father abusing her. Jimmy counters that those memories were false, saying she wasn't abused but treated as sacred. The revelation pushes Laura to the edge. Accepting his story would mean admitting her mind might be slipping back into psychosis. Jimmy stands firm, insisting it's all true. Before Laura can respond, David enters the room, his body now covered in a rash. He says it hurts. Laura and David immediately leave and go to another run-down motel. While driving, Paul receives a report from Steve regarding Jimmy's address, and they agree to head there the next day. Back at the motel, things spiral even further out of control. David grows increasingly aggressive, hurling obscenities at Laura and screaming for food. Terrified and overwhelmed, Laura flees to her car, breaking down in frustration as she struggles to understand what to do next. That's when she notices a sadistic thug in the next room violently assaulting one of his girls. A dark realization strikes her. Laura lures the man into her room. He takes off his shirt and sets his gun aside. David silently crawls up behind him. When the man finally hears a noise and turns around, David attacks without hesitation, turning him into a bloody meal. Afterward, Laura cleans up what remains, while David sits calmly in front of the television, watching cartoons, almost normal again. They soon drive to a nearby church, where Laura disposes of what's left of the body and scrawls another chilling message on the wall. He is coming. The following day, Paul and Steve arrive at Jimmy's house, only to discover another gruesome scene. Jimmy is dead, crosses jammed into his mouth, and the same ominous words carved into his chest. Suddenly, Steve gets a call from a lead. Laura has been tracked to a random hotel via her credit card. At yet another roadside motel, Laura and David share an unsettling moment of closeness. David describes a dream where he was flying, watching over her from above. He says the world was in his hands, until it split in two, engulfed in fire as people screamed below. Yet he felt untouched, powerful, like a superhero. "Nothing could hurt me," he says. Laura, fighting back fear, admits that his condition is worsening and happening more often. She promises to stay by his side, but draws a line. Whatever he's becoming, she won't allow him to kill anyone else. At the crime scene tied to the sadistic thug in the church, Steve insists it's time to tighten the net around Laura, but Paul urges restraint, arguing they shouldn't push her too hard. That night, Laura brings David to the amusement park. Not long after, David falls ill again, so she immediately takes him back to the motel. In the pitch-dark room, several men suddenly burst in. Panicked, Laura grabs the gun she stole from the sadistic man and fires wildly. When she finally flips on the lights, the horrifying truth is revealed. It was Steve and 2 other local cops she's just killed. After putting some distance between herself and the scene, Laura calls Paul, who's now standing in the morgue beside Steve's body. Through tears, she tells him she never meant to kill Steve. Paul pleads with her to surrender, but Laura refuses, saying she has to return to where everything began, the house she once shared with her father. When they arrive at the long-abandoned house, the banner from her memories is still there, fluttering in the wind. But instead of reading "He is coming," it now says, "Happy Birthday," hinting that Laura's version of reality may be deeply fractured. Upstairs, the bedroom looks exactly as she remembers it. Only the cult symbols are gone. She returns to the car, then gently brings him upstairs to the bedroom. There, Laura begins reciting the chant, every word coming back to her with chilling clarity. She demands the demon heal David, now fully believing the creature is his true father. Desperate, she warns that if it refuses, she will kill the boy herself. She repeats the chant again and again, until a grotesque, horned figure slowly rises behind them, inching closer. The room starts to tremble, and thick black smoke pours from the doorway. Just as the demon reaches for her, Paul bursts in with several officers. Laura insists she summoned the demon, claiming they frightened it away. She says the cult fed David human flesh to awaken the monster inside him. Paul refuses to believe it, telling her it's all in her head, and that he can still help her. But Laura says she loves David too much to let him suffer like this. As she raises the knife, Paul pulls the trigger, shooting her before she can strike. Later, at the hospital, David is slowly recovering, though he still looks fragile and drained. Paul gently assures the boy that he's there to protect him, to make him better again. When a nurse is distracted by an alarm and leaves the room, Paul seizes the moment. He pulls out a switchblade, slices into his own arm, and lets the blood drip into David's waiting mouth. Then he cuts away a chunk of flesh and feeds it to the boy. Paul warns him that he must keep his true nature a secret, promising that everything has been taken care of. A flashback reveals that he killed Jimmy to keep the truth hidden. Then Paul smiles and tells David he has one last surprise. "It's your father." David slowly rises from the bed, floating upward, drawn toward the same gaunt. The creature embraces him as David whispers, "Daddy," finally resting in his arms. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps like this. Thank you for watching.